Let me introduce Dario Geisinger. Dario Geisinger is from Uruguay. He's living and working now in Israel with the Tel Aviv team, with Dr. Carlos Gordon, and he conference with the about faster velocity perception with slower optokinetic nystagmus, a paradoxical perception in virtual reality. Welcome, Dario. Bienvenido.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure. Am I sharing my screen right now, the main screen?
No, not yet.
Okay, so how do I do that? Share screen. Okay, hopefully now.
Yes.
Yes, awesome. Okay, so thank you very much. It's a real pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to present our research. It's always, Sergio, a pleasure to see you. Indeed, I'm going to present particular in the phenomena that we saw with working with optokinetic stimulation and an explanation that we found for it and why we think that's important and some very fresh results that we have from actually this morning with Professor Gordon. So this is a joint research with the medical center in Israel, the Medical Center, Tel Aviv University, Engelberg and Professor Sivotowski from Maryland University, and Professor Suarez from Montevideo, Uruguay. So basically optokinetic stimulation, a flow of in this case, some bars, and the response is a compound eye movement, a slow phase in the direction of the stimulus, a fast phase in the opposite direction of the stimulus. And how can we create the stimulus? Several ways. One of them is the famous optokinetic drum. The subject is inside an area surrounded by stripes, and the whole walls are rotating, or there's a projector on top of the patient, and there's a screen that rotates and creates the optokinetic stimulation around the patient. However, we can also simulate this in the virtual reality world. So if the patient is wearing virtual reality goggles, we can create a stimulus that basically resembles the rotating drum. And for that, when we move things into virtual reality, we need to remember that when we move the head, the whole screen, the whole goggles are moving with us. So we need the graphics generator to compensate for that movement. Basically, we have a head tracker system that senses the movement of the head and updates the visual information in order to simulate the real world. In the case we have here with the on the bottom right, if someone is not wearing goggles and it's looking straight ahead, we'll see a valley. If the head is moved towards the right or the left, they will see the sun. Now, when we have the virtual reality goggles and the subject moves the head to the right or to the left, we need to somehow inform the graphic generator that the head was moved and update the image, so the new image is the one that it has the sun or the moon in the front of the visual field. Now, if we move our heads, this is more challenging. The image is changing as we move our head. So basically, what happens if we have the virtual reality without sensing our heads? And that's what we see in the upper part. If we are looking at, let's say, an image of just 1, 2, 3, and we move our head, of course, we move the head, we move the goggles, we will be seeing exactly the same image, very similar to holding a screen in front of our eyes and moving around. The screen doesn't really know that our head is moving. Whatever is in the screen will still be there regardless of our head movements. And just as a reminder, when we are in immersive virtual reality, so the head tracker is on, and we are looking at the sign that says 1, 2, 3, like in the bottom part, and we move our head, the sign will be simulated to be in the world, not in the goggles, but in the world. So when I look left or right, I will be seeing a totally different image. So in the virtual reality world, we can create stimulation that it's very hard to reproduce in reality, or maybe even stimulus that do not exist. And this allows us to explore different type of eye movements and the combination of eye movements in a way that is different from what we can do without with regular stimulus in real life. So we denominated optokinetic stimulation, OKS, to the stimulus that basically reproduces the optokinetic drum, the rotating drum. We numbered here the stripes, just of course for simplicity. In reality, they are not numbered, just for us to have a clearer picture of the stimulus. So if I move the head with the stimulus, we are assuming here a rotation from left to right at 90 degrees per second, and the head rotation towards one side and then the other, like I'm saying no, at the same 90 degrees. So in the first case, my head is to the right, to the left, sorry. I'm looking at bar number 1. I'm moving my head at 90 degrees per second. The stimulus moves at 90 degrees per second. I basically keep looking at the same stripe. And this is exactly what would happen if I move my head at the same velocity that the optokinetic drum is rotating towards the side of the rotation, the direction of the rotation. When I reach the right side with my head and I go now back to my left side, so I rotate the head back, I was looking at bar number 1 and now I'm looking at bar number 5. It means that there's an effective 180 degrees per second of optokinetic stimulation. And this is because the relative velocities of the head and the stimulus are in opposite directions. Now, if we turn off the head tracker, so the image in the screen is always the same, it's the same moving pattern without any consideration of the head movement, and that we call VR optokinetic stimulation. If I'm looking with my head towards the left to bar number 1, when I move my head 90 degrees to the right with the stimulus rotating 90 degrees to the right, I first move the whole world with me because it's in the goggles, plus the movement of the bars. So if I was looking at bar number 1, at the end in B, I'm looking at bar number 7. That means there was a 90-degree stimulus in front of my eyes. And when I move back my head towards the left, I went from seeing bar number 7 to bar number 5. So again, this is 2 bars moving in front of my eyes. So if I would have a small camera in my nose and that camera will be recording whatever I'm seeing, it will see roughly optokinetic stimulation of 90 degrees per second, where in the first case, if I simulate the drum, this tiny camera in my nose will be registering first from A to B, the same exact image, and then an image rotating at 180 degrees per second. So these are different stimulus based on an optokinetic stimulation. So what we did was we took 9 young students and we did simultaneous recording of the head and the eyes. And we presented in the virtual reality world 2 types of optokinetic stimulation, the 2 that were described before at an approximate rate of 30 degrees per second. And we asked them to move their head horizontally, like saying no, about 45 degrees per second with a 90-degree amplitude with an auditory cue. So after 1 or 2 movements, they were very well synchronized, moving the head to one side to the other. And we asked participants the following question. We used first one stimulus and then the other one, and we said, did you perceive the stimulus rotating faster, slower, or at the same velocity when the head moved in the direction of the stimulus compared to the head moving in the opposite direction of the stimulus? So just as a way of thinking a little bit further this, if we remember the VR optokinetic, we said we put a camera in the nose of the patient, we will see a regular optokinetic nystagmus. So the first thing we thought is, if the stimulus in front of the eye is the same, and the optokinetic nystagmus is a response to a visual stimulus exclusively, we will be seeing the same response no matter what head movement is being performed, whether on the direction of the stimulus or the opposite direction. And this is what we found. So when we asked them the question, with the optokinetic stimulation, all the subjects found that when I move my head ipsilateral, the same direction of the stimulus, I perceive the stimulus going slower. And this is very reasonable because when I move the head with this in the same direction of the stimulus, basically I'm doing a cancellation. I have the same image in front of me. So that appears to be slower than moving to the other direction. Whereas you remember there was 180 degrees in the example that we show. So we understand the first report of the subjects. However, when we did the VR optokinetic, the vast majority of the subjects responded that when they move in the same direction of the stimulus appears to go faster than when they move the head towards the opposite direction. Now, this was at the beginning a surprise because our first assumption was if the response is exclusively due to a visual stimulus, why would we have a different response whether the head goes in one direction or the other? But it was clear that there is a significant response, different response between the two responses that we show with both stimulations. So we went to see what happened with the eyes and see if we can get some explanation about this with the eye movements. And with the optokinetic stimulation, the one that simulates the rotating drum, we see that in the second half cycle, when we from 14 to 16 approximately, when the head goes in the same direction, there is no optokinetic response, which is understandable because I'm looking at the same stripe all the time. And when I go on the opposite direction, this is the first part of the cycle, from about 12 to 14, we see an optokinetic response. So this is what we basically expected, a VOR suppression in one direction and an optokinetic stimulation in the other direction. However, when we look at the VR optokinetic, when the head tracker is off, when the image in the goggles is always the same regardless the head movements, first of all, we see that there's a continuous nystagmus. And we counted the fast phases when the head moved in one direction and the other direction. And what we found is that there are less fast phases when the head moves in the same direction of the stimulus. So there are less fast phases in the same direction of the stimulus. However, that is when subjects reported that the velocity was higher. So usually we know that when we have an optokinetic stimulation, the velocity of the stimulus will condition my response. The faster the stimulus, the stronger my optokinetic nystagmus. In this case, subjects report higher velocity, even though they have less stronger optokinetic nystagmus on that direction. And this was the first thing that we noticed, less nystagmus, but a report of faster velocity. So the next thing we said is, okay, and then here, I don't know if the video can be seen clearly, but it is fairly simple to see that there's a lot of nystagmus, and then there's a period of less nystagmus, and goes back to more nystagmus and less. And that's basically what we hear. This was significantly significant, of course, and consistent in all subjects. So far what we've seen is that there's a stimulus optokinetic nystagmus simulating the rotating drum, VR optokinetic, where the head tracker is off and the flow in the goggles is always the same, and they are perceived differently when the head moves. And less nystagmus in the VR optokinetic ends up producing a faster perception of velocity. So the question we ask then is, why is the optokinetic nystagmus different when the head moves to each side in VR, given that the stimulus on the retina is always the same? And for that, we went back to see the recordings. And on the left, we have for optokinetic stimulation, and on the right for VR optokinetic. And what we can see is that when the head moves in the direction, the head is the thin line. When it goes down in negative velocities, we see that there's no nystagmus. There are a couple of saccades. We can also see that saccades go in both directions. And again, we can understand this because when we are tracking one of the stripes, there's no really preference for any stripe. So I might do some quick eye movements to reposition my eyes in another bar, particularly because the head and the stimulus were not exactly the same velocity. So I'm simply repositioning my eyes. But basically, I have a cancellation, a VOR suppression, whether in the other case, I have a regular nystagmus. And when we have the VR optokinetic, we see all the time a nystagmus, and we see that when the head has negative velocities, a thin line going down, there are less fast phases. But we can also see something that it's very interesting as well. Because when I said in the first case, the VOR suppression, a VOR suppression will be a velocity of the eye that equals 0. And here we see that that's not the case. It's true that we don't see optokinetic, but the velocity is moving. It's going, the thick line, the envelope of the thick line goes together with the thin line. So the eyes, the envelope of the eyes, it's going very similarly to the head, and that can be seen in the optokinetic, but that can also be seen probably a little bit less clear, but still in the VR optokinetic, where we have also the movement, the flow, the envelope of the eyes, the slow phase of the eye that follows the movement of the head. And we know very well that when we see eye movements that reproduce the head movements, but in opposite directions, we immediately will think about the VOR. So the question we ask is, this might be that we are seeing together the optokinetic nystagmus and the VOR acting together. And if that's the case, we ask ourselves, can that explain somehow the responses that the subjects had in terms of when the velocity is perceived faster or slower? So we have in case A, we have the stimulus Vs going from left to right. We have the velocity of the head going also from left to right. So this is in the same direction of the stimulus. And then we have VES, which is the velocity of the eye due to the stimulus. The slow phase will go together with the stimulus. But we have the velocity of the eye due to the VOR, and that will be the opposite direction. So we say if something is trying to move my eye towards one direction and there's another thing trying to move my eye to the other direction, effectively my eye is being slowed down. And slowed down means that I will have a slower velocity, so I will have less corrections. And that's what we've seen that actually happens in VR optokinetic. And then in case number B, when the head moves in the opposite direction of the stimulus, the velocity of the eye due to the stimulus and the velocity of the eye due to the VOR, they go in the same direction. So effectively speeding up my eyes and then require more fast phases to correct for that movement. So that hopefully will explain that when the VOR and the optokinetic system are working together, we can explain why we see the differences in the VR optokinetic on more fast phases and less fast phases. And we still have pending to answer why is it that we perceive the velocity differently. And particularly, why is it that less nystagmus produces the sensation of a faster velocity. And here we propose an idea that is that actually the optokinetic nystagmus is not just responding to a stimulus. It's not that there's a stimulus and my eyes are responding, but we like to think it as the optokinetic nystagmus is what the brain, our system, proposes to stabilize the image that we are receiving in the retina. So in that process, the VOR is changing the actual nystagmus, the actual optokinetic nystagmus. So if I have less optokinetic nystagmus, like in the case of A, less than I would have because the VOR is slowing down my eye response. So if I have a slower response, that means that the image that I have in my eyes will be unstable. I am actually doing less nystagmus that it would be required to stabilize that image in the retina. So an unstable image, the only explanation that our brain will find is that things are moving faster. That's why I cannot stabilize it. And in the other case, when the head moves in the opposite direction of the velocity of the stimulus, and we produce more or a stronger optokinetic nystagmus, that means that I'm using sort of an overstabilization mechanism. And if something requires a certain amount of nystagmus and I'm producing an overstabilization, then the only explanation is that things are actually moving slower. And that was a nice theory, because we saw results of the report of velocity, we saw the eye movements, and we came out with this idea of seeing of the optokinetic and the VOR acting together, which will basically explain both. And it's a very nice way of seeing them working together, but actually seeing them working separated. So in conclusion, the difference in velocity perception with this VR optokinetic nystagmus with head movements could be attributed to different eye movements depending upon head and stimulus direction. And these eye movements can be explained by simultaneous activation of the VOR and the optokinetic nystagmus. Of course, the next question might be a nice explanation, but why should we actually care about this? And we believe that there's still open questions that tests like this can start, or help at least contribute to answer them. So I specifically refrained to use the words smooth pursuit and saccadic movement when I was talking about the optokinetic nystagmus, because we know that the smooth pursuit actually cancels the optokinetic nystagmus. When I'm doing a smooth pursuit, the retina is receiving an optokinetic stimulation, but I don't present an optokinetic nystagmus. So in that sense, the smooth pursuit actually cancels it. But usually we refer to the smooth pursuit as one of the components of the optokinetic nystagmus. So it's which one is the one that is actually happening? There are questions regarding the smooth pursuit involved in VOR suppression. Is it that the smooth pursuit is actually suppressing the VOR? So when we have tests that can study eye movements in a separated way, but we can actually see them working together, that opens a lot of doors to study, for example, different pathologies where different eye movements are impaired, and that may shed some light on the interaction of those mechanisms that are involved in eye movements. And I want to show you very, very fresh results, actually really fresh from the ovens. We did this morning with Professor Gordon at the lab. And this is an episodic ataxia type 2. This is a patient that presents no optokinetic response. So for us was very interesting to study, and I'm going to mention very briefly the results because, as I said, these are too fresh and we haven't been through them, but I thought it was interesting to present as further support of what we've seen, because when the patient is subjected to the optokinetic stimulation with head movements, we see that instead of seeing VOR suppression, we see a response that it's mostly because of the VOR. We see when the VR optokinetic is presented in the healthy subjects, the nystagmus was an optokinetic nystagmus, which is something we don't see in this particular patient. We see in this patient that when the head is moving, the eyes have a very similar pattern to the previous case of the optokinetic stimulation. So we're asking ourselves, are we only seeing the VOR, which is actually fine in this episodic ataxia type 2 patient? This patient has saccadic smooth pursuit, has a normal VOR, but has no optokinetic response, nystagmus. So we hope that continuing doing further research with this test and understanding the results in different pathologies will help us understand more the eye movements. So I would like to thank you very much for your time and for listening to the presentation.
Okay, thank you. We are open to questions to Dr. Geisinger. I don't see any questions in the...
Maybe.
Jorge.
Very nice presentation. Thank you. The question would be, in patients with bilateral vestibular loss, you still will have the optokinetic access to the vestibular, to central lesions versus peripheral. In peripheral, you have no VOR, but the OKN will still reach the vestibular nuclei through the accessory optic tract. It'd be interesting to see how that interaction will work with that paradigm.
Absolutely, and this is probably what I presented the opposite case, where what we have is a functioning VOR, but not a functioning optokinetic nystagmus. definitely our next steps is to see what happens when we have the opposite situation, when there is an optokinetic response, but no VORs. Or so are we going to see a constant optokinetic nystagmus because now the VOR is not active, so there's nothing to modify this proposed optokinetic nystagmus, and the subjects will be reporting that the velocity is the same. So I agree, this is a very interesting question that we hope to answer soon.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
I have one question, sorry. I have one question. So a very, very good lecture, Dario, thank you. What is the, so I see that you record eye movements during VR. So what is your infrastructure? What kind of goggle do you use for, like, how do you measure eye movements in VR? What is the resolution? Just interested.
Yeah. So let me answer this way. There are certain VR systems that are that can measure also eye movements. When we did this, we didn't have one of them. So what we did is we actually mounted the VHIT goggles, and on top of, we calibrated them, and on top of that we mounted the VR system. So the stimulation was presented with custom software, and the recording was done with the VHIT equipment. Basically, we did sort of a VOR recording, so we have the velocity of the head and the eye in the raw data afterwards.
Have you used this for patients with visual vertigo who have, you think there is a mismatch?
Not yet. We only did this healthy subjects, and this morning we did the episodic ataxia. We did a couple more episodic attacks in the past, but hopefully those results, we will be analyzing those results later. But no, we didn't do yet any studies in visual vertigo.
Great, thank you.